Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to If Deku was a Demigod Part 5. Last time on the What If the final exams took place, with Suzuku and Bakugo working together, so they were able to pass, with Suzuku being able to distract All Might and Bakugo being able to get through the exit. Then shortly after the exams, Class 1A and 1B went to a summer training camp to try to get stronger with their quirks. But after a couple days, villains attacked the camp, with it ending with Bakugo getting captured by the League of Villains, and Izuku getting taken to the hospital. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we begin this what if the next morning after the attack. And when Izuku woke up, the sun was rising and he found himself in a hospital room. And when he woke up, he watched the TV that was in front of him. And with that, he was able to keep up to date with everything that happened, such as the amount of people injured, amount of villains captured, and that people are blaming UA for the attack and putting students in danger. And finally, that what he remembered was true, which was that Bakugo was captured. And he kept on doing this until eventually hours later, the remaining members of Class 1A that were left went into Izuku's room. And after some talking, Kirishima tells Izuku that he has plans to save Bakugo, and that they have a way to track where he and the villains are hiding. And hearing this, everyone tells Kirishima that they should just leave it to the pros, because they don't want another Ida situation. But without listening to them, Kirishima tells Izuku that he's doing his plan later that night. Then once he said that, he left, with the remaining students leaving shortly afterwards. Then after his classmates left, Izuku began to think about what he should do. But after a couple hours, he was finally able to come to a conclusion, which was that he would have to save his friend, which he failed to save last time, and that he needs to fix his mistake. Then hours later, after Izuku was done with all of his checkups with his doctors, Izuku was let go. And while Izuku was walking, he walked into Momo, who was going with him on the mission. So they walked outside, and when they walked outside, they saw waiting for them was Todoroki and Kirishima. And once Momo made a locator to track a tracker that she placed on Nomu, they began to walk away from the hospital. And because Ida was dead, he wasn't there to stop the group and join them. So the group walked to where the tracker told them to go. And eventually the group was able to get to what seemed like a normal building. But seeing as they were at where the tracker was located, Izuku began to focus, with him trying to find huge surges of electricity. And after a couple seconds, he felt huge amounts of electricity moving around in a nearby building. And feeling that, Izuku ran to a nearby window. And when he looked through, he saw Nomus being created and stored. And seeing this, the group began to try to think about what they should do now. But after a couple minutes before they were actually able to do anything, they saw a mountain lady grow taller than the buildings. And with one giant stomp, she was able to destroy a decent chunk of the building. And seeing that the hideout was taken care of, the students decided that the pros had everything under control. So they were about to leave. But before they were able to, a massive explosion erupted, destroying the buildings in the area, leaving just a wall of the building that was in front of the students, giving them a place to hide. And once the door was slow enough, Izuku peeked out from behind the wall. And when he did, he saw multiple heroes on the ground knocked out. The League of Villains were there, and Bakugo was trying to figure out where he was. But what caught Izuku's eyes the most was that there was a villain in a suit that he didn't recognize, but he seemed to be emitting his own aura of maliciousness. And just feeling this, Izuku immediately figured out that he was the leader. Then after a couple seconds, All Might came from the sky above, and he clashed with the guy in the suit. And when the two clashed, the two seemed to be at equal strengths. And while the two were clashing, the League of Villains members that were still conscious began to fight Bakugo. And after a couple minutes of fighting, it was obvious that All Might wasn't going all out. And Izuku presumed that it was because Bakugo was there, and that he didn't want to risk hurting him. And seeing this, the group of students began to try to think of a plan, with them eventually figuring something out after a couple minutes. And once the group was ready, Momo made a pair of sunglasses that block high amounts of light for Kirishima. And once Kirishima put them on, Izuku put his arms around Kirishima, and the two leaned up against the wall. And when the two were ready, Kirishima hardened himself. And once he was ready, Izuku used his wind manipulation to push the two of them as fast as he could, launching the two at the wall towards the fight. And they rammed through, making a hole. And after a couple seconds, they were around 40 feet into the air above the fight. And when they were over, Izuku let go of Kirishima while still using his power to keep up a strong air current for a couple more seconds, which allowed Kirishima to continue going flying while Izuku fell towards the fight. And while Kirishima was flying, he shouted for Bakugo to close his eyes and to get to him. And the second he said this, Izuku stopped focusing on Kirishima, and he began to focus on the electricity around him. And after a couple seconds, he felt like he got punched in the gut. And the second he felt this pain, a powerful bolt of lightning hit the ground between Bakugo and the League members. And because Bakugo listened to Kirishima and saw Izuku, Bakugo closed his eyes in time, allowing the bolt to not affect him. On the other hand, the villains looked at the bolt, making it so they got blinded for a period of time. And while the villains were distracted, Bakugo fired a massive explosion under him, making him go flying. And after a couple seconds, he was able to catch up to Kirishima. And thanks to Bakugo, the two were able to fly and land safely a block away. Meanwhile, while the villains were blinded, Izuku began to cover himself in electricity. Then he manipulated the air around him, and he used the air to make him go faster. And he quickly began to run towards the villains. And before they were able to move out of the way, Izuku tapped on all of them. And with that, they got many volts of electricity put into their bodies. And with that, they fell to the ground. Then once all the members fell, Izuku began to run away. And seeing this, All for One tried to launch an attack at Izuku. But when All Might saw him, he moved his arm, making the attack land away from Izuku. And after a couple seconds, Izuku was able to get out of sight. And when Izuku got a couple blocks away, he called the group he came with, and they discussed where to meet up. with them eventually meeting up on a busy street. And there, they were able to watch the remaining fight between All Might and All For One, with the results being the exact same as in the canon. So the League members got shot through a portal, allowing them to escape, while All For One got defeated and captured, but at the cost of All Might using the remaining remnants of One For All. Okay, so now we skip a couple days, and during those days, UA finally agreed on the dorm system. So Aizawa and All Might went to all of Class 1A's houses, and they told them that they will be moving into the dorms on campus. And because Izuku hasn't been as harmed as he would have in the canon, and because Inko sees it as being safer because on campus there will be many pro-heroes to protect Izuku, Inko agrees to have Izuku live in the dorms. Then a couple days later, Class 1A moved into the dorms, and when they all arrived, Aizawa told them that everyone besides Bakugo, Toru, and Jiro would have been expelled if All Might didn't distract everyone with his retirement, because no one stopped Izuku and the group from going to the villain's hideout. Then once he said that, Aizawa walked away, and he left the class to move in. And later that day, the same things happened with Sue. Okay, so now we skip to a week before the school year begins, and by this point, Class 1A has adjusted to the dorms. And that morning, Aizawa tells 1A to meet him in Gym Gamma wearing their hero costumes. And when they get there, Aizawa, Cementos, and Ectoplasm were waiting for them, and they were told that they will be coming up with ultimate moves for the upcoming provisional license exams that were in about a week. And when Aizawa was done talking, he began to spread out students around the gym, after giving them an Ectoplasm clone to train with Izuku after a couple minutes getting to his location. Okay, so during the week, Izuku practiced honing more of his wind manipulation, with him tapping into his power more with him learning about his Atmos kinesis, or the manipulation of weather, so for example, rain clouds or storms. Okay, so now it's time for me to explain Izuku's ultimate move, Thunder Roll Cyclone. So basically, what Izuku does is he uses both aspects of his abilities, so he creates a tornado around himself. And while the wind is swirling around him, Izuku focuses on the electricity in the air, and he increases the voltage, making it so bolts of lightning shoot out from the tornadoes or get spun around in the tornado. And from the heat of the bolts, the tornado gets stronger, making it go faster. And with this, Izuku can take down hordes of enemies either with solely bolts of lightning, or they get trapped in the tornado, and the electricity in the tornado makes their bodies go numb, depending on how much electricity is in the air. And he can make it last for around 2 minutes before he feels like passing out. And as for his hero costume modifications, Izuku's costume got a stronger polymer around it, to make it more like armor without getting rid of his dexterity. Okay, so now we skip to the end of the week, and Class 1A just got to the exam site. And when they get there, they meet the same people such as Miss Joken and Nasa. And after a bit of talking, Class 1A went to the exam site. And when they got dressed into the hero costumes, they went to the exam room. And when the main examiner believed that all the examinees were present, he began to explain the first part of the exams, which only the first 100 examinees if finished will pass. And when he's done explaining, he passes out 3 targets and balls to each student. And when they all placed them, the walls of the room began to unfold, and they found themselves in a large arena. Then they were given a couple minutes to split up and spread apart, with most of Class 1A sticking together. However, Todoroki goes off on his own, and in a group, Bakugo, Kirishima, and Kaminari leave as well. And once the time limit was over, the test began. And when it began, the crushing of UA began as well. So all the enemy schools began to run towards Class 1A, and they began to throw balls at them. However, with 1A together, they were able to not get hit, with them being able to protect each other. And Izuku survived by running around the people using the air to propel him, making him even faster. And with that, he was able to dodge with ease. And whenever a ball landed near him, he would pick it up and he would channel electricity into his hand, where the ball was, electrifying it. Then he would throw it at a nearby person. And with that, it would either hit a target, or it hit someone, and when it made contact, it would stun them for a period of time. But after a couple minutes of this, Yo realized that if Class 1A stuck together, they wouldn't be able to take them out. So he then put his hands to the ground. Then he began to vibrate, making tremors. And with that, the ground broke apart. And with that, Class 1A got split up, with them getting flung in different directions. And in the commotion, Izuku dropped his balls he had in his hands. And after a couple seconds, Izuku landed. And when Izuku was able to see again after the dirt slowed down enough, Izuku began to get up. And when he looked around, he noticed that there was no one around him. And seeing this, Izuku began to run around to try to find anyone. But after a couple minutes of running, Izuku heard something behind him, which made him look back. And when he turned, he saw nothing. But before he was able to react, someone pushed him to the ground. And when Izuku looked behind him, he saw Kami, who hit one of his targets. Then before she could hit another one, Izuku electrified his body, which hit Kami, so she immediately jumped off of him. Then once she was off of Izuku jumped to his feet. And when the two were standing, the two began a fight, with Izuku trying his best to hit her with waves of air, to try to make her slow down, while Kami kept on disappearing and reappearing, with her being able to get multiple hits off on Izuku. But eventually, Izuku decided to block himself completely, so Izuku began to focus, and after around 30 seconds, Izuku began to create a tornado around himself. And after around 30 seconds, Izuku noticed Kami flying above him, because she got picked up by the winds. And seeing this, Izuku began to focus even more, with him focusing on the electricity in the air, which made the tornado turn gray, and bolts of electricity circled around or shot out of the tornado. Then after a minute of this, the tornado had grown significantly, with it spinning even faster than it was before, and Kami had slowed down by a lot. And seeing this, Izuku slowed down the winds as fast as he could, making Kami get flung a couple feet. Then after a couple seconds, after the dirt settled down enough, Izuku saw Kami standing back up, injured, and her muscles were tense from the electricity coursing through her body. And seeing this, the two were about to continue the fight. But before they could, they started to get surrounded by an enemy school, because they saw the tornado from a huge distance away. So they ran towards the tornado. And seeing this, Izuku looked to where Kami was. But when he did, he saw that she was completely gone. And seeing that it was Izuku alone, the enemy school got ready to throw their balls. But before they could, an army of birds flew at the enemy school, and they began to peck at them. Then while the enemy was distracted, purple balls appeared behind them, which when they took a step made them get stuck in place. Then seeing this, Izuku began to look around. And when he did, he noticed that his classmates had appeared, with them being Ochako, Sero, Koda, Tokoyami, Mineta, Ojiro, Toru, and Mina. And once Mina saw Izuku, she told him that they were able to come together because they saw a giant electrified tornado. So the two schools began to fight, and with the enemy school already having its numbers dwindled, it was easy work. So after combat for around 7 minutes, everyone was able to get the targets that they needed. And once they got their targets, they were told to go to the waiting room. And once the whole group got to the room, Bakugo, Kirishima, and Kaminari got there as well. Okay, so now we skipped some time. So now the first phase of the exam was over, with the only person who didn't pass being Ayama, because Ida didn't inspire him. So he was found by an enemy school, then eliminated. Okay, so now we skip to when the second phase was about to begin. So the main examiner was at the front of the room on a giant podium, and there were many screens around the room, and the main examiner congratulated them all for making it to the second phase of the exams. Then once he said that, he turned behind him and he looked at a screen, and when he did, footage of the city they were just in showed up. But then explosions began to go off, with them destroying buildings. And when the explosions were over, the examiner told them that a villain had just attacked the city, then fled. But there were many civilians that got caught in the crossfire, and he told them that it was their job to rescue the injured civilians. And once he said that, the room began to unfold. And when the room was completely flat, the exams began. And when it did, the remaining members of Class 1A were in one group, besides Bakugo, Kirishima, and Kaminari, who went on their own again. Okay, so the big group began to run around looking for civilians. And after a bit of time, they came across a kid who had blood coming from his head. And Izuku got some points taken off because while he was busy analyzing the wound, he said out loud that it didn't look good. And after Izuku got yelled at by the kid for being too blunt, Izuku smiled at the kid and he told him that everything will be okay. And when the kid saw this, he allowed Izuku to take him to the first aid station. So Izuku then put the kid on his back and he began to run towards the first aid station, while the remaining group went to look for more victims. Then after Izuku was able to secure the kid at the first aid station, Izuku began to run towards the city to look for more civilians. But before he could go too far, he and everyone in the arena heard the main examiner out of the speakers, and he told them that the villain that attacked the city has come back. So now, not only do they have to save the civilians, they also have to stop the villains. Then after he said that, a massive explosion erupted from the wall of the stadium somewhere near the first aid station. And when the dirt and dust settled enough, Izuku was able to see Gang Orca and dozens of its henchmen who was beginning to walk towards them. And seeing this, Izuku began to run towards the group of people. But before he was able to get to them, he got stopped by Yo, who continued to run towards the group. Then when he was somewhat close to the group, he put his hands to the ground and he used his quirk to create tremors on the group. But as a counterattack, Gang Orca used his quirk and hit Yo point blank with an ultrasonic wave attack, paralyzing him. And when Yo hit the ground, Izuku began to run towards a group of villains. And running alongside him was Inasa and Todoroki. And Izuku began to fight Gang Orca with his electricity. But while Izuku was fighting Orca, Inasa and Todoroki were fighting, so waves of flames were flying everywhere. But eventually, a wave of flames began to fly towards Yo. And seeing this, Izuku began to run using the air to propel him. And when he got to Yo, he stood in front of him, and he waited for the flames. And before the flames hit, Izuku manipulated the wind to make the flames go around them, until they eventually passed and died down a couple feet later. And when Izuku was done manipulating the air, "What the hell is wrong with you two?" Then he immediately ran back at Orca, and he began to continue his fight with him. And when Izuku got to Orca, Todoroki and Inasa had finally listened to what Izuku told them, so they decided to work together. So they made a fire tornado around both Orca and Izuku. And with Orca drying out, he was losing more strength. So after some time, Orca pulled out a water bottle and he poured it out on himself, to try to rehydrate himself. But when he poured the water, Izuku, taking advantage of the water, electrified his body even more, and he punched using his knuckles on the wet area of Orca. And because of everything going on, Orca falls to a knee. And seeing this, Izuku tried to go in for another punch. But before he was able to land it, Orca fired an ultrasonic wave attack at Izuku, making him get hit head on. And Izuku got flung back, with him landing on the ground outside of the fire tornado. And because Izuku has been using his abilities so much, and because of the amount of damage he's taken, he can't get back up. But before Orca could do anything else, the main examiner announced through the speakers that the final civilian has been saved. So now the exams are officially over. And that's What If. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you next time on Something Z.